This panel discussion deals with reentry. And as we did with the format with the last panel, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce herself or himself, and then we'll proceed with a few questions. And if you believe you're going to have some questions to ask them at the end, please write them down or take notes, and I know they'll be happy to answer them. Shirley?
Good afternoon. My name's Shirley Poe, and I'm a consultant. I do some work with the Parolee Reentry Court in Alameda County. I probably have about 36 or 7 years at this point working with the offender population. I retired from the Department of Corrections, and I was the regional director there. And I was talking to someone, and I was telling them that I was responsible for somewhere over 28,000 parolees, and they said, well, that's bigger than our Department of Corrections. So that just goes to show you the scope of what we were dealing with in California. I do this work because I really believe it's my life's work.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Chris Watler. I am the director of the Harlem Community Justice Center, which is a community court and resource center in New York City. The Justice Center has a housing court that hears cases from East and Central Harlem, both private landlords and public housing, family court, and we run reentry programs, including the state's only parole reentry court, which I'll talk about later.
Hello, I'm Joel Rosenthal, and I am with the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, the Veterans Justice Programs, I was just going to say, by way of introduction, that the VA is certainly much less involved in reentry courts than we are in the Veterans Treatment Courts, I had the good fortune of coming to an understanding about the reentry courts as a result of about 3 10 o'clock in the evening calls with Judge Manley. One of the things you have to understand about Judge Manley is if you want to talk to him, you have to be available around 10 o'clock in the evening. And anyway, through a series of about 3 of those calls, I came to understand reentry court, so I'm pleased to be part of this discussion.
I'm Judge Stephen Manley, and I preside over a very large reentry court.
Okay, Shirley, based on your experience dealing with the population that you have dealt with, what do you see as the challenges for the homeless ex-offender, and what is the impact of what we do can do to prevent homelessness for them?
Okay, Judge Brangle, first of all, let me say housing has always been a challenge for ex-offenders returning home. And unfortunately, in our nation, we have not done a good job at preparing them for their return home, and I'm sure everyone knows that. Many are returning home with nowhere to go. A lot of paroling to areas that are so unstable that they become homeless shortly after they're released. Now, I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that we basically left it up to the offender to fend for themselves. And they get into this cycle of sleeping on a friend's sofa, they'll go to a homeless shelter, they'll sleep in the park in their car, as Judge Manley was mentioning earlier, and oftentimes that's when they have more contact with the police, sleeping in the streets, and they go back to prison. I'd like to give you some statistics today in terms of how many ex-offenders are actually released from our correctional institutions who are homeless. However, I don't really have any because there's no national data that we collect on this issue. Some of our larger states like California and New York, they basically say they have around 10% that are released homeless in California. And some of the areas that are more condensed like San Francisco and LA, it could be anywhere from 30 to 50% at any given time. In New York, it's somewhere around 11 or 12%. So, Judge Branco, you asked me about the challenges. When you look at the barriers that ex-offenders face when they're released from state prison homeless, they're not a lot different than the offender that you see every day. Their challenges have more to do with the issues around the fact that they have a felony conviction. Also, they're released from state prison with little money. They get gate money here in California, and I can't speak for every state, but they get gate money. And often that money is just enough for them to get a bus ticket home and maybe get a hotel for one night. They have issues with literacy issues. They have issues with no family support, mental health issues. Of course, we know they have issues around alcohol and drug problems. And they have poor credit histories that now, I was laughing about this with a friend recently. We were talking about when we were in college, you could just go up, meet the apartment manager, sign an application, and rent an apartment because everything was done on the fact that, oh, well, she looks like a nice person. But now you have to go through a whole process of credit checks, criminal background checks. So our ex-offenders, they don't qualify. So what does this do to the ex-offender? Well, I talked to some of our program participants in the Parolee Reentry Court, and this is what they told me. They said, once again, for them, it's saying to them, we're not good enough. They also said what it does to them when they're released without a place to stay, it immediately sets an environment for instability. And it also sets up fear. We don't often talk about offenders feeling fearful, but one offender said to me, Ms. Poe, if you didn't have a place to stay, if you didn't know where you were going to lay your head tonight, how would that make you feel? And I had to think about that, and I said to myself immediately, well, I would be really concerned. And he further said to me, and you're asking us to do all of these other things to meet those criminogenic needs of education, drug treatment programs, all of those things, but yet I don't know where I'm going to stay. So these are some of the issues that we're dealing with in reentry. Also with the offender, often they qualify for SSI because of either mental health or other disabilities, and they were receiving it prior to getting out. But once they go into prison, those benefits stop. There's not a lot of programs in our institutions where they begin to apply for the SSI early on. So most of the time they have to wait until they get out, and it could take almost up to a year in order for their benefits to start all over. Some of them have issues with restitution, child support, and also they're unable to access government subsidized housing. I was sort of laughing when I heard Judge Mantley say, what good is it to qualify for this housing and it's either too expensive or you can't access it? And that's pretty much the problem, because a lot of our offenders go back into low-income urban areas that are already overburdened with ex-offenders in the area and other people who need these services. I was looking at an article that said out of all the people who applied for the subsidized housing, only a third was able to obtain the subsidized housing. So it's a really complex issue. There's no silver bullet, there's no quick fix. But we have to do something. Let me tell you why. We're spending billions of dollars in this country on reducing recidivism, we're spending money on reentry, but yet we let people walk out of a prison door not knowing where they're going to go because we've never performed an assessment on them, we haven't done any appropriate discharge planning. And that has an effect on their ability to successfully re-enter into the community. Now, a lot of people aren't really concerned about homeless ex-offenders when we have all of these homeless people in our country who haven't committed any crimes. So the question that was presented to me is, why should I be concerned about a homeless ex-offender? Well, the reason you need to be concerned about a homeless ex-offender, because it's more cost-effective in order for us to house an offender in the community than it is to return them back to prison. In addition, it's more cost-effective to help them reintegrate back into the community, because when they're out homeless in the streets, actually a lot of homeless people who haven't committed any crimes are being victimized. So now let's talk about it, and I'm going to hurry up because we have so many good programs we want to talk about. Let's just talk about a couple things in terms of reentry. Research has shown that in the first 30 days after release, that's the critical point. That's the turnaround point. If the person doesn't feel comfortable, if they don't know, if they don't feel safe, and that's not a word we actually connect with ex-offenders and criminals, is feeling safe. Well, they want to feel safe too. And if they don't feel safe, they're going to revert back to what they know, and that's survival. So let's talk about what we can do to prevent this. First of all, if I don't say anything worth you listening to today, I'd like you to listen to this. We have to do discharge planning. It's amazing to me that there are states still throughout the country that don't plan for an offender's release into the community. They don't do assessments. They don't know what the needs of that offender is. It's amazing. We have to determine who is going to be homeless or who's at risk for being homeless. No one should be released from a facility and we don't know where they're going to lay their head. The next thing we need to do what we call pre-release resident checks, because that gives us a lot of information. And what this is when an offender will be released, they have to tell the correctional agency where they're going to parole to. Some put homeless, some put a family member, some they just give an address. We need to verify that address because we need to immediately engage the family. Because when we engage the family, that tells us a lot, tells us several things. One is whether or not this person is at risk to be homeless. Oftentimes, I remember when I was a young agent in the field, I would go to a home and talk to the resident, talk to the mother, father, whoever, and they would say, well, he can stay here, but I leave to go to work at 7 in the morning and I don't get home till 7 at night. He can't get a key, so he's gonna have to stay out in the streets until I get home. Well, to me, that's not an appropriate place for that offender to live. And the reason it's not appropriate, because it's, once again, saying something to them that you're not good enough, and also it has him in the street for 10 or 12 hours. So it allows you to find out what the issues are to determine whether or not the parolee is at risk for being homeless. Also, it allows you to find out what the needs of the families are. Because often we send people back into situations that are toxic. And so if we can begin to determine what those needs are for the family, we can also get them connected into services and have a good environment for the parolee to live in, and also have the family receive some of those services that they need. The next thing I think is important for us to do, I heard the last speaker say, collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. And that is so important. You need to know. And you don't have to work for a correctional agency. You don't have to work for a court. You can work for a homeless agency. You can be a concerned citizen. You need to know what services are available for the parolee when they return back into the community. And for us here who work for either courts or reentry or work with offenders, we need to engage our CBOs, our community-based organizations, because these should be your best friends because they have some of the best information. We need to work with agencies who offer housing. We need to see what services our correctional agencies offer. Oftentimes we have I got ready to say CDCs, but for those of you who don't know that, it's for me, it's California Department of Corrections. They have what we call halfway houses, reentry houses, and that allows the offender to come out prior to the expiration of their sentence, allow them to work and live in the community to save money to prepare them for when it's time to move out and get their own place. We need to look at what other services are available, such as transitional housing, resident to multi-service centers that provide housing and support services for our clients, and anywhere from literacy to vocational training, job training, anywhere from employment life skills, all the ones that you're probably aware of. We need to work with the faith-based agencies, faith-based churches, whoever that's connected with faith-based. I heard Judge Manley say earlier that that was new territory for them. We don't utilize faith-based enough. And also we need to educate the public. I was sat for a minute in another meeting, and we were talking about engaging people in dialogue. We need to educate the public and let them know what the effects are of having homeless parolees in the community. Not only the social effects, but the economic effects for us as a society. And I still believe in exploring our subsidized federally funded programs. I know a lot of our offenders don't qualify because of their felony convictions, but there are some cities that have relaxed some of the rules. And the cities do have the ability to do that. And you need to find out who they are. In LA is one example. The county supervisors, they set aside some housing vouchers to allow low-level offenders to move up in the line. And so I thought that was excellent. They got a lot of criticism because they were told you're pushing other people further back down the line just to help ex-offenders, but it was more cost-effective for them to do that in the city of Los Angeles. And also we need to educate our offenders on what programs are available for them in the community. They need to take some responsibility, and they want to feel empowered. They want to know what's available. I'll be honest with you. I know we probably hear in the media about all the offenders that don't want to do anything, but there are more that want help. There are more that do want to change their lives, and we need to begin to empower them to do that. And also, briefly, we should have a master list of all the programs in the county that anyone has access to. If you're a homeless treatment provider, you should have access to all the services, because these aren't services in isolation. If a person doesn't have a home, you can give them a home, but they need a lot of other services. So I think it's important. I really believe that without all of us working together to solve this issue, not only about homelessness, but reentry into the community, then we'll never be successful. And I have to briefly point out Judge Manley, and the reason I always do this, he probably gets tired of me doing this. Judge Manley is a good example of someone who did that. He wanted to start a program in his court in Santa Clara. And Judge Manley picked up the phone, called the California Department of Corrections. I was on the other line, parole, and told me what he wanted to do. I thought, what is he talking about? I have to be honest, I did, but he explained to me how the court could help us. And Judge Manley started, I believe, the first program here in California that dealt with parolee reentry. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shirley. And you were talking about publicly subsidized housing. And Chris, do you have any information about that and any
Sure.
project where you work dealing with public housing?
So I'm gonna preface what I'm about to say to one, say that it really is kind of inspiring. I know it's hard for us to think about this because we're advocates and people in government. We work every day in the trenches. But, in reality, our system of social services is set up to regulate people. It's not set up to be necessarily humanizing or particularly overly generous and stuff. And so we should just admit that fact up front. And so a lot of the fights that we have around money and getting things done are important, but behind those fights, there's a real need to think about how we do the things that we aspire to do. And I think that's the challenge. So Shirley presented, I think, a really nice comprehensive list. If I were putting together a state's reentry policy, I would essentially take her list and do that. So I want to focus a little bit on the how around some of the things that we have done, on some of the things that I think are important for any good reentry program that wants to address the issue of homelessness. So in Harlem, we're a reentry court. Actually, my judge is here, Judge Campbell, so I want to point her out. We actually work under the auspices of parole. So Judge Campbell is administrative law judge. my team are case managers and social workers. And we have been able to convince the parole agency to co-locate parole offices in the community. So one of the hows for me is to think about the communities where the impact on reentry is particularly pronounced, and to try to locate programs that are serving individuals coming home from prison in those communities. So our clients, the 250 or so that we serve every year, can actually walk to the Justice Center, and they can come there even when they're not reporting. And so that's an important element that I think is essential, because if we're going to really reduce recidivism, we have to, of course, do good clinical interventions, good supervision, but we also have to kind of change the game in these neighborhoods that are disproportionately impacted by these issues of reentry and homelessness. So our clients, we actually begin working with them before they're released. So the other how for me is you need a good relationship with your corrections agency. I realize that that's not easy to do, and I've certainly heard stories here in California about how difficult that is. But the reality is for corrections agencies that their business model is changing, it's evolving. Fewer people are going to go in, they need to do a better job with the ones who are there. If your state is like mine, we're seeing older, sicker people staying, who are kind of staying in longer, and younger people who are actually continually cycling in and out the system for serious crimes. And those individuals, those younger folks, are actually at higher risk. So another kind of how piece is we need to have contact with people before they actually get out. Doing that is like a golden moment, right? So for our program, we will go into a pre-release facility in New York City to begin to do some of the work. We do call-outs in that facility. But we also, for every client who's coming out, we send them a welcome packet before they hit the street, so they know that they're coming to us. We're able to do this because we get the community preparation list from the corrections agency, so we know 4 months in advance who is coming out. We work with our senior parole officer to make selections to the program, and our program only works with high and moderate risk individuals. So for a reentry court, we don't want to work with low-risk individuals. They should come out on regular parole, get access to services that they need, and if parole is good, they just stay out of their way for the low-risk guys. The high-risk folks are different. We need to structure their time and really work very closely with them. So we do a couple of things that I think are important when someone comes into the community. One is that before they get to a hearing, my staff and the parole officers would have discussed this case in a weekly micro-team meeting. So that's a meeting where the clinical people and the supervision people from the corrections agency are sitting at a table actually going through the list of people and focusing in particular on how we as a program are going to respond to behaviors. And that conversation happens I think in a way that is helpful because we use an actuarial risk assessment tool, the COMPASS. So that's another how tip, that even for someone who's homeless, the homelessness is one issue of many that we need to address in terms of reducing their criminogenic risk. They may be mentally ill, they may have substance abuse issues, they may need a job, they may need to reconnect with family. So there are a whole range of issues that we want to work with our clients around. And so that team meeting is very important. And again, that's not, you don't need any extra money to do that. That's a matter of kind of arranging the relationships in your system. But let me talk about homelessness in our client population too. About 15% of our clients who are coming out homeless. And in New York, in our county, I'm not going to speak for the whole state, but certainly in our county, we've done a lot of work, the parole agency, to try to address homelessness, to reduce the number of people leaving prison to shelters. But it's very challenging, similar to San Francisco, maybe some of the other jurisdictions in California. Rents are really high in New York. We have a high concentration, very large. New York is maybe one of the few cities that has very large public housing developments. And in Harlem, a lot of our clients actually used to live in public housing. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, something we're doing there. So 15% of our guys tend to be homeless. If they have a drug problem, we're pretty good at getting them into a residential treatment program right when they come out. So that's very helpful. That also means that we need to line up their insurance and the other things that they need to access those programs. So we're pretty good at getting them access to those programs, partly because we assess. So another how, we actually spend a lot of time knowing what treatment providers can actually work with our clients. Now, it's a little bit of trial and error. So we don't just send our clients anywhere. We invite providers to come into what we call a monthly macro team meeting, where we vet them, where they actually present on their services. The judge is often there, our parole officers, case managers, some of our other partners, and they have to present to the team about how their treatment program works. And then we will work with them to see how, if they work for our clients, how to make that happen. And then we check in on the quality of that, especially early on in that relationship. So that's another important how, right? We got to know the providers in the community and know which providers are right for which clients. Some of our clients who are mentally ill and chemically dependent will have the opportunity to go to residences where they can live in the community and have those services. And then a small number of our clients may actually wind up going to a shelter initially. So a couple years ago, we were approached by the New York City Housing Authority, which had been thinking about creating a pathway back into public housing for parolees. Now, you have to understand that public housing residents in New York City are very prickly about the idea of ex-offenders living in public housing. I credit the Public Housing Agency for having the courage to even consider this. And what they did was to assemble around New York City a few organizations who were doing good case management work with persons on parole. And they were talking to the parole agency about, about creating this pathway. Why were they motivated to do this? One of the things they knew, parole knew, is that about 1,500 parolees were actually living in public housing illegally. They technically were both putting themselves at risk and putting the leaseholder in public housing at risk, because that leaseholder could be evicted just for having that individual. But what does that situation really represent? It represents the fact that a loved one in that person's life was willing to take that risk for them, to help them out. For the parole agency, I'm not going to say they were breaking the law, but they certainly were aware that individuals were living in these housing, because parole is under the gun to find people housing. If someone's in stable housing, it's problem solved, right? But so there's tension between the public housing agency and parole. So the question is, how could you have someone return to public housing, but do it in a way that was going to ensure that they were getting services, and the leaseholder, if the leaseholder needed services, to make that home appropriate for that person, or there were other issues that needed to be resolved that happened. So we are now part of a collaborative that is piloting about 100 cases ultimately across the city. We've actually just sent our third person there. They go through an extensive review process. They have to be in the community for at least 3 or 4 months and prove that they're successful in treatment actively and adhering to their supervision requirements on parole. And then NYCHA will look at the housing person and assess the housing. We put in an application. The client can return home. If they are successful, after 2 years, they get to be on the lease. So this is a huge benefit for this person, not only in the short term coming home, but it also enables them to have permanently an affordable place to live. So I'll stop there and we can talk later.
Thank you, thank you. Joel, you talked about it briefly earlier today, but what's the VA's overall approach, if any, to assisting parolees and reentering veterans?
Thank you. What I'm going to do is approach this in the short time in the same way as this morning. I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to show a short video, and then I'm going to talk a little bit right after that. The first thing I was going to say is I'm actually going to answer a question that was asked this morning that there was not an opportunity to answer then. And the question was, and I don't know if the gentleman is still here who asked it, but the question was, are there not some crimes that one might commit that would rule somebody out for VA care? And really the answer to that is no. That it is, if somebody has served their time and is good and is in legal status, which might be on parole or probation, whatever, but they are in a legal status where they are not in violation of some sort, then their criminal history is not an issue in terms of if they are eligible for VA services, they are eligible for those VA services. And there's nothing that precludes that. Certainly if somebody has pending charges or has outstanding warrants, felony warrants, that sort of thing, that may be a factor in terms of either our provision to be able to provide services or which programs they might be able to enter into, but it's not the past criminal history is not a rule out in any way. So in terms of reentry and working with parolees, a little bit, I don't want to repeat what I talked about this morning, but I just want to re-highlight that our programs, the Veterans Justice programs, are outreach-oriented programs. So we are reaching out to veterans who are incarcerated in state and federal prisons and jails with the idea of doing the kind of planning and so forth that was talked about in conjunction with the planning that is already being done. And one of the things that we have to offer to those systems is that we can take the load off for those 10% or so of their population that are veterans. So that's a big piece of what we do. We're also looking at ways to be able to do that because of the geography of particularly the prisons, but the jails as well. And so we're starting to look at and develop technologies around telehealth that would allow us to do some of the outreach or possibly compensation and pension examinations in the prisons and jails. The other thing I would re-highlight is the system that I mentioned this morning, Veterans Reentry Search Service, the system that I discussed that allows any justice partner to work with us, so there can be at whatever interval makes sense for that system to be able to do a data load of information into the system and get fed back everyone who has a history of military service that is in their prison, jail, court, that sort of thing. One thing that was done that may seem like, in the big scheme of things, a relatively small thing, but it was a huge undertaking, and it was big in that it made so much sense and it needed to be done. And that is that in the VA system, we can actually cannot provide treatment and care to anybody who is incarcerated. We are precluded by regulation from providing that care to anyone who is in the care of an agency that constitutionally is who is obligated to do that. So we can't provide that care. So the interesting thing was those who were paroling from the federal prison system, when you go into it, typically they come out and they go into a federal halfway house for 6 months. They are still in federal custody. So they were living in the community, but they were not able to receive VA services living in the community. And my boss, who recently retired, spent about 3 years championing the cause of getting that regulation changed, which is now changed, and so there is no preclusion now for those folks getting those services. I mentioned the late night calls with Judge Manley, and the clarification that came out of those. The reason that I think that it took me 3 calls was because when I thought about reentry, I automatically thought about people leaving and coming back out, which obviously reentry and reentry courts address. The piece that Judge Manley was helping me to understand is it's also on the flip side, that at least in the model as I understood it from you, is that we are also trying through the reentry courts to keep people from going back. And that seemed like a huge, very, very important piece. And so when I think about that, that leads me to another piece with the VA, and that is that our linkage of folks to services. So whether it's on the preparation and then the coming out end, or while they're in the community to try to help stabilize them and keep them from going back, It just seems like having access to those kinds of services is huge. And one of the things that that is difficult is to be able to say, well, we know this is working. People are really, now that we've been around a little while, they're starting to say, well, how do you know what you're doing is working? How do you know that all the resources that the federal government is pouring into the Veterans Justice programs is an effective use of funds? And that's, it's a really important question. So we now have a 3-year evaluation that we are conducting that has just begun. So we are doing that in 5 cities with five VAs, and in each of those VAs there will be 300 veterans that will be followed over a 3-year period. 100 that we've worked with in our prison outreach program, 100 that we've worked with in our jail outreach, and 100 that we've worked with in the court system. And so there'll be a total of 1,500 veterans that will follow over a 3-year period and look at things such as rearrest, reduced recidivism, as well as other psychosocial indices such as addressing issues around mental health and addiction, employment, stable housing, those kinds of things. So with that, the other piece that I wanted to do, 2 more pieces I'd like to do, and one was I was going to talk a little bit about our services, but the way I'd like to present that to you is I have a video that is just under 4 minutes, and it's an informational video that we worked with an Iraq veteran upon his return. His name is Kyle Hausman Stokes, and he came back from his time in Iraq and went to film school in Southern California, and worked with us on creating this video that has been distributed to every state and federal prison in the United States, and now we're in the process of getting this out to the jails so it can be viewed by inmates. And I think from this you'll capture a feel for this kind of the service continuum in the VA and how we get this message to incarcerated veterans.
I've worn a lot of different kinds of suits in my day. The first one I can remember was a sweatsuit. It was red, white, and blue. I used to wear the hell out of that thing as a kid, especially on the 4th of July. After that was a hand-me-down suit that didn't fit so well. Might have been a little snug in the neck, but it still scored me a date to the dance with Stephanie Smith. I joined the military after high school. That suit was camouflage colored. It may not have been the prettiest number I ever wore, but it sure made me the most proud. I used to think about that uniform a lot because after leaving the service, I got myself into some trouble and, well, let's just say it earned me the right to wear a different orange jumpsuit every day. I spent a lot of time wondering if that was the last suit I was ever going to wear. I mean, it was the first time I'd ever been locked up. To be honest, I was starting to lose hope. But that all changed one day, and never in a million years would I have guessed it would be because of that camo suit I used to wear. Another vet told me about a rep from the VA who comes out to our facility. This rep calls himself a Veterans Justice Specialist, and he was looking to get in touch with any of us prisoners that had ever served in the military. I told my corrections officer that I was a vet, that I wanted to speak with this VA rep, and you know what? The rest was history. I've learned so much from talking to this guy, like how being incarcerated, convicted of a felony, or other legal issues in the past does not exclude us veterans from getting the VA benefits we earned, and how I could set it up so that my family could collect the remainder of my disability benefits while I was serving out my sentence. But I think the biggest help was learning about all the stuff that was waiting for me at the VA as soon as I got out. From helping to find transitional and permanent housing, to help with getting a job or getting back to school. You know, using your GI Bill, to medical and mental health services, and programs to help me with things like PTSD and addiction problems. I've learned a lot, and I mean a lot, of good stuff that I never would have learned had I not gotten in touch with that Veterans Justice Specialist. Together we ironed out a reentry plan. He said it was one of the most important things for me to have, and because he had me take care of all the eligibility paperwork ahead of time, my transition out was a lot smoother than I had ever imagined. Even if I hadn't had a plan at all, I found out that just getting to the closest VA is all it takes to get the ball rolling. There's VAs everywhere, and there is a Veterans Justice Specialist at each one. So yeah, that orange jumpsuit I used to wear every day, that orange jumpsuit is a thing of the past. I did my time, Made the most of it while I was there, and thanks to all the services and support that camouflage suit earned me, I'm finally getting to try a new one out. It's called Pinstripes.
As a veteran and veterans justice specialist, I want you to know there are many things you can do that will make a difference in your life while you're still here. And after you're released, find out about these things and take advantage of them. No veteran is forgotten. Ask to speak to a VA representative, and we will do all we can to help you help yourself.
Nice.
So, what I wanted to say is follow up to this. Again, Kyle Hausman-Stokes was the producer director, and he's really a brilliant young man. And he had his own battles with PTSD, and actually I would direct you to a video that he did called Now After. It's on YouTube. Now After, Kyle Hausman-Stokes, and it's a 12-minute piece that he did that's an inside-out look at I think his own struggles with PTSD and coming back, and it's you know, very, very poignant. So we, as I mentioned, we've distributed this around to the facilities, and now some of the jails, and we're getting ready to move it out to all the jails since we've gotten it out to the prisons, it's you know, we found it a great vehicle in conjunction, you know, with the outreach that we're otherwise doing. So to finish out, I just wanted to mention 3 or 4 things that we are doing additionally through the Veterans Justice programs that I think really dovetail with a dedication to working with parolees and reentering veterans. One is that we're very aware of the fact that in the typical VA service continuum, there's not really services at this point, or historically have not been services that are to address the kinds of things that are described as criminogenic needs, that sort of thing, or reduction of recidivism and addressing those kinds of risk areas. So we are looking at that very hard and really encouraging VA staff to get training in things like moral recognition therapy, thinking for a change, reasoning and rehabilitation, 3 of the evidence-based treatments that, you know, that are documented to be effective in reducing recidivism, and we're trying to actually look at encouraging the look at those from an empirical standpoint to determine efficacy and evidence basis with veterans. To that end, we actually contracted for what we called a structured evidence review around the treatment issues of justice-involved veterans, and that document is available if anybody is interested in seeing that. That is now available. You can just email me, joel.rosenthal@va.gov, and I can provide that to you. So it's a look at treatment needs and then recommendations for starting to meet those unique needs, the additional needs of the justice-involved veteran, and we're now getting ready to embark on one that is directed towards employment and employment issues for justice-involved veterans that probably will be available in about a year. The other couple things I wanted to mention is that we just were on a call recently where we were discussing at some length the transportation pilot in the VA system. It was mentioned about that critical 30 days, that first 2 weeks, that first 30 days, and so we're under discussion with one of 3 pilots in the VA that would be oriented towards the justice programs, that would be looking at things like getting folks from jail, from Elmwood to the VA, or from prison to the VA gates, or from your court to the San Jose outpatient clinic, that sort of thing. And the last thing I want to mention is that we have a pilot going with the Department of Corrections in California with a prison in one of the prisons, both of the prisons in Soledad. That grew out of a contact with one of our veterans justice reentry specialists, where the request was, can we come in and provide PTSD, trauma-related care to incarcerated veterans because we're the ones with the expertise and their staff doesn't have that? The answer, of course, was no, based on the regulation that I described earlier, and we really don't anticipate that regulation changing. So the next question was, well, could we use our expertise to come in and train the mental health staff of the prison system so they could then do that? And I'm pleased to say, after a long battle, we have a pilot going in that prison where 7 mental health professionals from those 2 prisons were trained in a VA training around what's called cognitive processing therapy. They got the training, and now they're in a 6-month case consultation with our same trainers and starting to see veterans in the prison, and we're collecting data on that as well to look at the efficacy of that as an approach so we can provide our expertise without violating the regulation of not providing the care directly.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Stephen, you surely mentioned that you have been on the ground floor with parolee reentry courts. What do you see as some issues that are raised, especially as it deals with homelessness, but any other issues with parolee reentry courts?
Okay, briefly. Whoops, I forgot this doesn't move. Okay. When I started the first parolee reentry court in California, the goal was the same one it is today, and that is basically our problem in California is that our prisons have become so overcrowded that we're under federal court order to either release prisoners. The state must either release them or build more prisons. And the reason that we have so many people in prison is not because there's a lot of new crime being committed. It's because the same people go back again and again for violating, at that time, their parole. And the idea of the reentry court is that if you could stop people from going back again and again, you could keep them in the community longer, and that would improve not only their outcomes, but it would help the state, and that has proven to be the case with reentry courts. But I think that more importantly, what reentry courts did was they helped us in a process in which we are now still undergoing, where the state of California has changed our laws, and now nearly half of the people, the individual offenders who would be in prison now, are no longer going to be in prison. They're going to be, if they're incarcerated, in the county jails. So the change that's taking place by law is that those who would be the responsibility of the state are now the responsibility of the counties and the responsibility of the courts at the local level instead of the Board of Parole Hearings at the state level. And what that really means is the issues such as homelessness now become for parolees, because even if those who are retained as parolees and are still released from prison as parolees, they, if they do not do well in the community, can only go back to jail. Now, if you follow me, my theory is a very simple one, and that is this. We have 58 counties and 58 jails. About 26 to 30 of them are so overcrowded that they either have a cap on the population or they have a court order that they can add no more prisoners. So what that means is if you have roughly half of the counties in this state, including the largest one, Los Angeles, under these caps, the decisions about sentencing will be made by sheriffs releasing people early rather than judges who impose the sentences. And what that means to a local community, as far as I'm concerned, is that if you don't deal and approach and systematically take on the responsibility of providing the services and the treatment that these offenders need, you are going to end up with a very, very crowded jail and automatic releases of many prisoners, with no requirement that the only ones that be released be those who are low risk and low need, because that isn't required at all in the law. Well, what that leads me to is the fact that at the present time, and Shirley's talked about this, parolees, and I work with them every day, they just simply don't believe in themselves. They have lost all hope. They don't want to be incarcerated, but they don't understand much about how not to be. And what they know how to do best is commit crimes and do drugs. They know how to manipulate too. They're very good at that. But leaving that aside, those are the two things. And if you think about homelessness, well, what is homelessness to a parolee? Homelessness is often, and it's been discussed by others on this panel. It's always being in the wrong place. It's couch surfing in the wrong apartment. It's always, it is so complicated because they are at risk at any time of being rearrested for violating the terms and conditions of their release. And the best way, I think, to start to deal with that is because what happens is when you're homeless as a parolee, you live wherever you can. If you're living in the streets, you're likely to be rearrested. If you're couch surfing, you're likely to be in the wrong place. The local communities have to step forward and start providing the housing for these offenders. In my program, which is high risk, high need, 98% of my parolees use drugs all the time. Almost 50% of them are rearrested within a month of being released. Now, when you look at that, and that's high risk, that's my definition of high risk, high need. I know we're working with the right people. The challenge to find appropriate housing for them and to help them stay in the community is a very large one. And it begins with some of the things Joel's been talking about, and that is teaching offenders how to think differently. What I find is when parolees get out of prison, unless they have a family, which may not be where they should be, as Shirley has pointed out, the last place they should be, but unless they have some tie like that, they are as lost as anyone in the community. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to order a meal. They have done nothing but be incarcerated for a period of time. And they don't know what to do. And so what do you do about that? Well, one of the things that we did when we started the Reentry Court, and now since we're taking on more and more responsibilities, is to create a center in the community where all those released, in other words, your obligation is normally report to your parole agent, report to your probation officer. Well, it's now report to this reentry center where you get assessed and where there are services. The very services that Judge Lindley described, where you've taken the state money in our community, the parole money, which generally is always kept separate, and join it with the county funded programs and put them all in one place. So at least if you can get the parolees to go there, you've started down the road to providing them with services. Because I think that is the real problem. You see, reentry courts only work when people screw up. And again, I say, we don't need people screwing up. We have to put more emphasis at the front end. And that will mean building more housing. It will mean that the state is going to have to invest more money because we simply don't have the housing. And they don't get housing. So we're going to, they just don't. They are discriminated against. No one wants them. And in my experience, you just can't sit back and let that go on. So it is a real problem, and I hope that the ABA and those here start to focus more on this, because this is a group who I think have more stigma and more discrimination than any other. I'm going to close with the one other group that no one talks about. But I can tell you in California, this is a group of homeless individuals who pose the greatest risk to the public, and we ignore them, and those are sex offenders. In my program, we accept sex offenders. And those of you not from California may not know this, but in our state, we have many propositions that are passed by the voters, and they are never overturned. Occasionally they are, but very, very seldom. And we have a proposition that mandates that as to sex offenders, parolees, they have to wear GPS at all times, and they cannot reside anywhere near a school places where children are, where public parks and so forth, and it's all as the crow flies. You know, in other words, it is not, oh, well, this is fine because you can never get to that place anyway. It's on the other side of the freeway. No, if you do the mapping and you find that they will be within that area, they can't be there. And what that means is they live in a very small area. I have a very large county, as there are many, many large counties in this state, and there is nowhere they can live in my county other than 2 specific geographical areas that are near a creek where all the homeless people live. And so if you follow me, these are public lands where the public go out and hike and run and so forth. And the very individuals who are living there are the sex offenders. Because you cannot build housing for sex offenders, you cannot move them into any housing unless it meets the requirements of the proposition, and that means there are literally nowhere you can place them. And this group is ignored by everyone. And so what we are trying to do, and I mean it's a rare time that I think this would ever happen, and if it works it'll be wonderful, is again the county and city are considering building a facility for them. And why do you build housing for them? Because there's nothing else you can do until the law changes or the Supreme Court says the law is unconstitutional. And whether that happens, we don't know. But my point in this is that we really need to pay attention to this group of offenders and parolees, a lot more than we ever have in the past. We've ignored them, I think, to a large extent because we have assumed that homeless people are just, you know, these are all good people, really. But parolees are never considered to be good people. And of course that's not correct. Shirley's absolutely right. They have dreams, they have hopes, they've screwed up, but they don't want to do it again. They're as good as the guy in the movie. Not all of them, but a whole lot of them. And yet they get the least attention when they're homeless. No one wants them, and they don't qualify for anything. And so this is one area in which I really think we need to have a strong voice out in the community to provide them housing. Because if we don't, the guarantee is we will have more crime because they will reoffend. You can't. This has been demonstrated. The research is very clear, because we've been able, and Gordon has been running a wonderful reentry court in Alameda County. I mean, Gordon actually talks one by one with each and every one of those parolees. You know what that does? That changes the way people look at themselves. But because of our reentry courts alone, we have cut, and we're having an evaluation, and the first year data is out from the evaluation. The number of days in jail is 50% less than the comparison group. And that's when there still isn't housing, when we still have them all using drugs, but they're getting better, you see, and to me, that's what this is all about. So I urge you to consider this group for the future.
Thanks, Stephen. I know we have another panel, Paul, and so if there's some quick questions, I think we can probably take 2 at the most. Is anyone? Yeah, sure. Right over here.
I work in the UK, and the government has been trying to do a lot of changes to the criminal justice system, but they've been trying to do it as cheaply as possible. One of the things they've recently committed to doing is providing every prisoner who leaves prison with a mentor, with a volunteer mentor, to sort of facilitate their exit out of prison, because that's pretty cheap and it's free, basically, and they think it's an effective way. Does the panel have any views on supporting returning prisoners, in their re-entry, use of mentors positively?
So I'm fond of saying that often in criminal justice we look for the mosquito net solution to things, right? Like mosquito nets are very effective at malaria, they're cheap, and you can give them out really quickly. Reentry doesn't lend itself to that. So when I hear schemes like that, I always get a little nervous about that. With that said, we do know that mentors can have a big impact on people's lives. So I'm not sure how you would do a program like that to scale. I guess that's the challenge. we have a program in Harlem where we invite religious communities to come in and volunteer in the courthouse to create kind of informal relationships with the guys. It's not proselytizing, but I don't know if I were the head of a state or a government entity, if I would want to scale something, like that up. I do think for younger offenders, there's been more research about the efficacy of mentoring for young people. So there's an opportunity there, maybe for young adults to think about mentoring relationships. But I would see that if that's the reentry plan, I would be very nervous.
Well, and I think if you look at any program in the United States, that's been started, they will have a mentoring component. Like the veterans courts all have a mentoring component. But that comes way down the line after you deliver the services and the treatment. What they're doing is just, finding the cheapest way to avoid a problem or criticism, whatever.
I'm sorry, I saw another hand out here.
Well, there's no funding stream I know of. No one. There is a funding stream, but it doesn't go to that. The state is required to expend a great deal of money under this proposition, but it's for sexual treatment, mandatory sex education. It's not education, it's treatment to change the way they think and act and so forth. It's behavior change. And a great deal of money goes into it, but no, there's no money for housing. What I look at is, for example, in our county, as I mentioned in the earlier panel, one of the things we're doing, we have found some old motels, and we are converting them into housing units. They happen to be in one of the 3 geographical areas where sex offenders can live. So, in other words, what I always say is go look at your community. Where can they live, and what could you put there? Even a shelter, even military style. Using anything is better than what we're doing now, because one of the biggest problems is the parole agents have trouble finding them. And they're always in the wrong place, you see, so they're a violation every moment of their day. So that's what I believe in, find where they could live and then make it happen.
Can I say quickly that we've begun experimenting with social impact bonds here. That could be a funding stream specifically for supportive reentry housing. I'm not as excited about the approach yet, but New York, we're doing it around workforce stuff for folks who are reentering. So this is where private investment comes in, and if you make certain benchmarks, the investors get kind of a return on their investment, and it's a way to fund programs to provide money up front. The other thing that I think is interesting in New York, the Osborne Association is actually taking an old prison that the state essentially has given them, right? So and turning it into supportive housing, reentry housing. So that you can do that kind of stuff when your recidivism rate goes down because your state adopts real good policies. So our prison system went from 71,000 to 54,000. So our governors closed prisons. So those, in this case, this is a facility in New York City that is being repurposed by a nonprofit for housing. So there are always these opportunities to do stuff like that.
The VA has a program called Grant Per Diem, and that I mentioned earlier today about transitional housing. That is one of our transitional housing programs, and that's housing can be up to 2 years. And the housing is provided by community providers in contract with the VA. The contract is such that that they get paid a per diem for every bed night for each veteran. And any potential grantee could write into that, for example, X number of beds that they were where they were trying to set aside those beds for those with sex offense histories, for example. And so that's an ongoing cloud. We have over 15,000 beds like that around the country that are community beds that are funded per diem by the VA.
I'm sorry, maybe there'll be an opportunity to speak further with panelists, and maybe some are on your panel, Paul, I don't know. But if we just thank this group of people for... Thank you.